Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Tackling Child Poverty in the Wake of COVID-19. I'm Cara Baldari, Vice President of Family Economics at First Focus on Children, a bipartisan national children's advocacy group dedicated to making children and families the priority in federal budget and policy decisions. First Focus is also the founding member of the U.S. Child Poverty Action Group, a partnership of organizations working to establish a national commitment to cutting our child poverty rate in half within a decade. This webinar is being held during First Focus's third annual Children's Week, where we host a series of events to amplify the issues most important to our nation's children and call upon our country's lawmakers to act in their best interest. More information can be found at our websites, firstfocus.org, as well as endchildpovertyus.org. We are honored to be co-hosting today's webinar with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and the Century Foundation's Bernard L. Schwartz Rediscovering Government Initiative. I want to extend a big thank you to all of the staff at the National Academies, Century Foundation, and First Focus who helped to make this webinar possible. And before I go any further, I want to acknowledge what a painful time this is in our nation, and that many of us are coming to this webinar with a lot of grief. The killing of George Floyd and others at the hands of the police, along with a pandemic that is disproportionately impacting communities of color, are stark reminders of the trauma that systemic racism causes for our nation's children and families of color. Even before the COVID health emergency and resulting economic downturn, child poverty was a moral crisis in the United States that affected each and every one of us. Despite low unemployment and economic gains in recent years, our child poverty rate remains consistently higher than that of our peer countries, and poverty rates for children of color are 3 times that of white children. The pandemic and resulting economic crisis have served to only expose and exacerbate these existing inequities in our society. Unemployment is reaching levels not seen since the Great Depression, causing low-income household budgets to be stretched even thinner. The closing of schools, childcare centers, and summer camps are leaving parents and guardians with few options for childcare, while also creating widening learning gaps for children. Research from Columbia University predicts that child poverty could rise by as much as 53% as a result of the outbreak. And 40% of mothers with children under 12 report in April that they're struggling to put food on the table. Aid passed by Congress, including expanded unemployment benefits, stimulus payments, and increased food assistance are helping, but distribution of assistance has been slow due to administrative hurdles, and many children are not eligible for these benefits, including children in immigrant families and children in Puerto Rico and the other territories. Many of the solutions needed to address increases in child poverty due to COVID are the same ones that were necessary before the outbreak. While more emergency relief is critical to counter the current economic downturn, we also know that longer-lasting structural investments are needed to address our nation's consistently high level of child poverty. Today, we will hear from the authors of 2 landmark resources on child poverty, who will detail the consequences of poverty for our nation's children and our society as a whole, as well as explain what the research finds is most effective to address it. Our panelists include Jeff Madrick, who is a senior fellow and director of the Bernard L. Schwartz Rediscovering Government Initiative at the Century Foundation and author of the recent book, Invisible Americans, The Tragic Cost of Child Poverty. Greg Duncan is a distinguished professor of education at University of California, Irvine, and chair of the Consensus Study Committee that authored the 2019 National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine study, A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty. Christine James Brown is the president and CEO of the Child Welfare League of America and is also an author of A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty. And Dolores Acevedo-Garcia is the Samuel F. and Rose B. Gingold Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at Brandeis University, as well as the director of the Institute for Child, Youth, and Family Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis, and another fellow author of A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty. And before I turn over to our panelists, I want to note a few logistics. All attendees will be muted throughout the broadcast. Closed captioning is available for this webinar, and you can select this option at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions, when you could submit using Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. While we won't be addressing questions until the end, please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar and signify if you'd like to direct your question to a specific panelist. We have a large crowd today and won't be able to get to all of the questions, but there will be an email address provided in the chat box if you'd like to follow up afterwards. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Century Foundation's website under the Events tab in about 48 hours. And while you are listening in, we encourage you to share what you are learning through Twitter using the hashtags EndChildPoverty and Children's Week 2020. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to get us started.
Cara, thanks very much. Thank you all for attending this webinar. Thank the panelists. Cara put it very well. Children in America have been in a precarious position long before the pandemic began. The pandemic is now surely clobbering them. Some will fall into poverty, some others will fall into poverty, maybe many others, depending on congressional action. They are not ready for this pandemic. I wrote this book. It's hard. I'm thinking back about why I wrote this book. I think it was Anthony Atkinson who told me child poverty is the biggest economic problem in the world. Then I started looking up the numbers, this was 5 or 6 years ago, about American child poverty. How, let me put it plainly, how can the wealthiest nation in the world have the highest child poverty rate among virtually all wealthy nations? How is this possible? One reason, of course, is attitudes about poverty that are long-standing in America. I write about this some in my book, and let me just show you the cover so nobody will complain that I haven't tried to promote it a bit. I write about this some in this book. Our attitudes about poverty go back to the 19th century. More Americans, according to more recent surveys, that is post-World War II surveys, think less of the poor than people in other countries, in particular Western Europe and Canada. There's a serious prejudice against the poor, which results in one point only: they should take care of themselves. This somehow is slopped over to child poverty. There is basically an idea that parents should take care of poor children. The problem is this: child poverty has persisted through economic growth, even in the immediate post-World War II period, and children suffer. There is an avalanche of evidence to show that child poverty causes cognitive disadvantages, emotional instability, and indeed, most alarming, possibly brain damage. It also there are both short-term effects and long-term effects. The long-term effects we see in reduced wages, reduced working hours, and ultimately high incarceration rates. It is unambiguous that poverty affects children. But here's the main thing, and one of the main points I emphasize in the book, again based on the evidence provided by these scholars. Money matters. Money matters. There was a time when even caring progressive economists would argue it's really not money. It's really not being poor. It's hardship, material hardship, hunger, lack of decent housing, lack of decent schooling. But evidence has mounted, and it's virtually undeniable, that money alone can reduce poverty. Michael Katz, the famed historian of poverty policy, noted that poverty is the third rail of American politics. Politicians don't want to deal with it. It doesn't win too many votes. And I remind you all of the recent Democratic presidential debates where in the first 6 or 7, and I think I counted correctly, child poverty was mentioned only once in a serious way, ultimately by Cory Booker, and only once in passing by Bernie Sanders. How can that be? It just can't. What are some of the examples of evidence that money matters? The most famous and maybe the most fun is that the Cherokee Indians in the Carolinas opened a casino and decided to give all parents of children a substantial gift. Analysts analyzed what happened to these children, and the consequences were extremely beneficial. They did better in school, they had a lower crime rate, and I think a higher proportion went to college. I don't remember all. My two favorite examples are the expansion of the EITC in the 1990s, in which analysts discovered that those who got more money from the EITC had children who did better in terms of schooling and other factors than other kids. The other one I love is 100-year study. Widows were given special They were given special bonuses back in 100 years ago, approximately. Analysts studied the outcome for their children. Obviously, many of those children, if not all, I assume all, now that I think about it, died. And it turned out that they had a higher mortality rate. They lived longer than children whose mothers did not get pensions. Very evident. One final point, a major point, is that child poverty hurts us all, not only the children. Estimates are that it cuts GDP by as much as $1 trillion. It makes kids less productive. It requires more social spending, and many of the poor kids go to jail. The final point is this: when money matters, it suggests a serious solution, and that solution is give kids more money. Again, let me cite Michael Katz. It's quite amazing how often we disregard that simple fact. Money will reduce poverty. And we now know that money will reduce the deleterious consequences of child poverty due to the virtually heroic work of many analysts who have looked into this issue. My book ends on that. We need to give kids cash allowances. Today, they take the form of child tax credits. The CARES Act has a child tax credit attached to it. We can only hope that it's expanded beyond 1 year. My own hope is that it's expanded above $3,000, the current proposal, and $3,600 for kids under 6. We know that $4,000 in Canada, for example. We at Century commissioned a report comparing the Canadian child allowance to the American child allowance from the Columbia Group, and we found that they cut poverty considerably more. There's no reason not to push this higher to $4,000. One last word about racism, because the child poverty issue cuts not only across poverty lines and class lines, but across racial lines and across lines of economic power. It's very important to understand that Blacks, and I think most of the audience probably does, but Blacks and Hispanics suffer more from child poverty as a proportion of their population than do whites. This is a very serious issue. If we really want to get the country to appreciate people of color and bring them into the fold, we should begin with child poverty. Let me stop there. Cara, let me stop there.
Good. So shall I go on, Cara? Okay, good. Hi, thank you so much for attending today. I appreciate the opportunity to present our National Academy report. We have a couple of other participants, as Cara said, in the committee that produced the report, Chris and Dolores. We labored mightily for 2 years and are now decommissioned. So we are speaking for ourselves and not on behalf of the National Academy. National Academy itself was founded 150 years ago in the middle of the Civil War. It was chartered by the US government, but it's not really a government agency. And its mission is to provide advice to the nation. In our case, Congress requested that the National Academy convene a panel to study the issues of child poverty, and in particular to develop ideas for how the nation could cut child poverty in half in 10 years. So the 10 years is important. We were focused on short-term kind of programs, not intergenerational programs like Head Start. So we worked hard at trying to come up with ideas, policy ideas that would either individually or in combination cut poverty dramatically in the country. We reviewed some of the same evidence that Jeff talked about. I should point out, we've got a book too. This is available actually for free on the National Academy Press website. So if you just want to download a PDF of it, you can do that. One of our tasks was to review the evidence on the impacts of child poverty on children. Jeff reviews this in his book in chapter 8 and reviewed it in his comments. Our conclusions were basically the same as his if you look to these various kinds of studies to try to see whether money itself is the active ingredient behind poverty's ill effects on kids. The conclusion that we drew was that the weight of the evidence indicated that indeed it was, that poverty impacts were particularly deleterious for kids when they occurred early in life and when they were long lasting. And we went beyond some of the evidence that Jeff talked about to look at impacts of programs themselves. So to what extent did the introduction of the food stamp program have an impact on kids, the introduction of medical insurance programs of various kinds? So beyond the question of whether money itself matters is a question of whether programs that the nation has come up with to address poverty have beneficial impacts on kids. And here again, the evidence was not completely unanimous, but the weight of the evidence did indeed suggest that many of the programs that we built up over the last 40 years or so as part of our safety net indeed have impacts, beneficial impacts on children, on birth weight, on children's achievement in school, even on the health of children when they become adults. So our main task was to try to come up with ideas for reducing child poverty. We cast a very wide net and tried, our committee itself was very ideologically diverse. So we came up with a variety of programs. Some were work focused, some were more just plain income focused. We had a couple of policies related to immigration, the treatment of immigrants in our safety net programs. So a very wide variety. The idea was not to come up with any single program that the committee could get behind and recommend. We were really too diverse a committee to reach any consensus on any single program. So what we did was try to see across all these programs what impacts were. We were interested not only in impacts on poverty, but also impacts on employment. The poverty debate is really focused on both of those issues. To what extent would expanding a program benefit children by reducing poverty and increasing family income, but also to what extent would it change employment? And some people are quite concerned about employment impacts of programs. So our study in looking at these 20 programs looked not only at poverty reduction, but also employment changes. As you might expect, employment-related programs like expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, like concentrating the benefits of the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit on low-income working mothers, those kind of programs reduce poverty somewhat, and they tended to have a quite positive impact on employment. On the other hand, pure transfer programs like the child allowance that Jeff suggests, or expanding the food stamp program, tended to have a larger reduction on child poverty, but at the same time it had a reduction in employment as well. One of the things we discovered was that the reductions in employment from something like a child allowance were on the order of 50 to 100,000 jobs. The kind of increase in employment that you could get from expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit tended to be much larger, on the order of 400,000 jobs, 500,000 jobs. So I think one of the innovations, this is something that I hadn't really anticipated when I joined the committee initially, was that you could think of putting together packages of programs that would combine income support with work incentives. And perhaps you could get the best of both worlds in that way. You could get both quite substantial poverty reduction as well as increases in employment. And that is indeed what we found. Just to give one example, with 3 changes in the tax law, namely increasing the earned income tax credit somewhat, concentrating the benefits of the child and dependent care tax credit on low-income families, and converting the child tax credit into a child allowance of the kind that Jeff talked about. Those 3 things together would decrease child poverty by more than 1/3. It would decrease deep child poverty by more than 1/3, and it would increase adult employment by more than 500,000 jobs. So this idea of packages, I think, is something that came out of our report that's kind of a new policy idea. We have been, when we explain what the report's about, we've been trying to promote the idea of the benefits of thinking in terms of packages. So that's our report, and Chris and Dolores will talk more about different aspects of our report. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Jeff, for that. So I'm going to turn the first question over to Dolores. A roadmap to reducing child poverty details how poverty affects children of color disproportionately and how child poverty rates vary across the United States. And we know that COVID has only served to exacerbate these disparities. So can you talk a little more about the policy solutions modeled in the study that would have the biggest impact in reducing racial and ethnic disparities, and why these policies are relevant to address the disproportionate harm to children of color that we are seeing being caused by COVID?
Dolores, you're muted.
Yeah, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Karen. So it's not really possible to talk about child poverty in the US without talking about deep inequities in child poverty by race and ethnicity. These are, of course, long-standing inequities, but the recent social, economic, and health crisis is making them even more visible and more urgent to address. Our National Academies Committee did a very good job at examining these gaps in child poverty within our scope of work. So just to review some of the facts first, poverty rates, as Jeff mentioned, are much higher among Hispanic and Black children. By the supplemental poverty measure, white children around 2015 had a poverty rate of about 8%, Black children 18%, and Hispanic children 22%. Also, over time, because of the increasing diversity of our child population, the composition of our population of children in poverty has changed in a really major way. Today, Hispanic children are the largest group of children in poverty. They represent more than 40% of all children in poverty in the US. Very sadly, the health and economic crisis that we're experiencing is increasing these disparities. We know that we hit an unemployment rate of nearly 15% in April, and Hispanic unemployment rate was nearly 19%, which is a record level and is the highest rate of any group. So clearly this is going to have implications for Hispanics and for children that live in these families. We went into the crisis already with much higher poverty rates, but we also know that some of the children in Black and Hispanic families have also been affected by the pandemic disproportionately. The Center for Social Policy at Columbia University estimates that if we were to reach an unemployment rate of 30%, which of course is a very, very high rate, and we hope not to get there, poverty among children would increase from about 14% by the supplemental poverty measure to about 21%. For us, every US citizen, for us, members of the committee, of course, this is devastating because our goal was to reduce poverty by 50%, and here we are facing the prospect of an increase of 50%. This is, of course, very, very serious because of all the reasons that Jeff and Greg discussed so eloquently before. So we need to do something to address this. What is very good news is that the analysis that we did in the report shows that these packages that Greg was talking about not only reduce poverty among all children by about 50%, but they also reduce poverty by about 50% in each of the major racial and ethnic groups. So the two packages that achieve this goal, to summarize really briefly, one of them uses 2 tax credits, the EITC and the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. It also uses expansion of 2 safety net programs, SNAP and housing vouchers. That's one packet. And the other packet has different elements, but the key component is a child allowance of $2,700 per child per year. So both of these packages achieve the goal of reducing 50%, the poverty rate by 50%. They'll also reduce the rate by about 50% for Hispanic and Black children. They also reduce inequities in child poverty. Inequities persist, but they are smaller than at baseline. So I want to emphasize what Cara said in the beginning. Of course, we're in the midst of a major crisis, but we know that some of the solutions that we have analyzed and we have put forward before the pandemic can work and would work even in the present situation, and we just need to tackle them.
Thanks, Dolores. Next question I'm going to give to Christine. So the study lays out that child poverty would be much higher without effective anti-poverty programs that we've heard a little bit about already. So family tax credits, nutrition assistance, housing vouchers, and more. And we know that these programs boost family income either through direct support or assistance that frees up income for other resources. Yet we also know that there are contextual factors in a child's life that influence the effect of these programs. Can you lay out some of these factors that were discussed in the study?
Sure, thank you. I just want to go back and reinforce that the study, because of its design, required that we look within that 10-year horizon and that we looked at things that were evidence-based. But we also knew as a committee that we really had to look at what are some of the contextual factors that would influence the ability of these, the programs are recommending to actually work and work for all children and families, not just some. I think actually this pandemic has illustrated the significance of looking at these contextual factors. But there's a couple of things about them. We don't know enough. There's not been enough research to say that there's a direct link between some of these contextual factors and the ability of these programs to be successful. So the lack of good empirical research is one thing. The second thing is that they're longer term. But I think that the pandemic has said to me that there are some short-term things we need to be thinking about in order to make sure we don't get further and further behind with respect in particular to communities of color and rural communities, and what we've not mentioned, tribal communities, that because of their size were not lifted up enough in the report. So the contextual factors, stability and predictability of income, the fact that people really need to know from month to month how much money they're going to get so that they can do what they need to do, the good planning that's needed. Access to programs and services, equitable access to programs and services is a second contextual factor. Racial discrimination that Dolores was just talking about is another contextual factor. The fact that if you're going to say, let's give them money for housing, if they're going to be discriminated against, it may take them longer to have access to that housing. Treatment by the criminal justice system. The fact that people who have a record don't always have access to all the programs and services that are required for them to be able to move forward is another one. And then positive neighborhood conditions. You know, what kind of resources and programs and conditions are in a neighborhood that either help or hold people back? And I just want to give a couple of examples, primarily in positive neighborhood conditions. So think about the significance of the internet and having access to the internet throughout the pandemic. The schools that were able to get their children up and going in education because their parents had the money and access to all of the cabling and everything that's required, those are the ones that children fell further, did not fall as far behind. So just access to the internet and knowing that the majority of people in rural communities are struggling with that kind of access. And some of the creative solutions that we came up with in the past several years to deal with that weren't viable. Putting the internet access at libraries, putting the internet access in neighborhood centers. People weren't able to access them because of the pandemic. So we now know we've got to solve that, or we're going to leave a lot of people behind. The Center for on Budget and Policy Priorities has just launched its very aggressive campaign to make sure that the 12 million people who've not applied for their stimulus money, whether it's because they didn't have access to the internet or they just didn't know about it for other reasons, to try to bring them forward and get them to get that stimulus money. That's no different from all the other programs that so many people in these communities are missing out on just because of where they live, or because of the differential approach that their state happens to take to eligibility, to automation, to get access to benefits and that type of thing. So in my view, the contextual factors that we laid out have really, to me, gone way up in importance, which means we need more research to make the case that they're connected to making these programs viable, but that research may take too long. We just need to try to do some creative things to allow people to have access to the kinds of programs and services that they need, so we don't increase the disparities that exist in this country between Black and white, rural and urban, and otherwise. So the contextual factors to me are critically important. I encourage you guys to look at the chapter 8 in our book that talks about them in greater detail. I think they're really now something that we have to roll up in our sleeves and work on in a much more aggressive way to make sure that we come out of this pandemic in the right way.
Thanks, Christine. Jeff, I'm going to pose the next question to you. So you talked a little bit about this already, but can you detail a little bit further why it's so important to zero in on a child allowance, right? So this idea of expanding the child tax credit and converting it into a child allowance as a leading part of a poverty reduction strategy. And what do we know from other countries who already have similar programs in place, including, their experience during COVID?
The reason I focus on the child allowance is that it can get poverty down quickly. Cash can cover a lot of situations. If you have more cash, if the family has more cash, it reduces stress, which we now know is such a factor in damaging children. It may allow people to move into better apartments and better neighborhoods, even better schooling. Cash is a major factor. It's been very successful in Europe and almost all Western European countries, and even the notorious England, where poverty rates have come down. Research generally finds that parents spend the money on their kids to improve their lives. So I think the best, I always get a little nervous about what I call the all-court press on child poverty because it doesn't get done. Many institutions talk about wide varieties of factors. I shouldn't pick on the Children's Defense Fund, but they will come up with 10 or 12 policies that have to be adopted to reduce child poverty. I want to get it done and get it done fast. I want to emphasize that children are suffering, especially to our audience. Somehow I think we don't fully know that. Fortunately, most of us don't have poor children. They suffer because they're pessimistic. They suffer because they don't think they have opportunities. Many of them are in pain due to poor health and poor teeth and so forth, bad ears. They don't have a sense of optimism, and they lose faith and hope. That's a serious condemnation. One of the areas of research I would like to see amplified that doesn't get done very much in US, and I had to depend to some degree on research from England, is that we don't interview poor children enough to see how they really feel about how they live, about their parents, about their conditions, about their teachers, how they might be affected by money. And I think there's a prejudice against kids. Poor kids are expected to do poorly, are expected to be not merely rambunctious, but dangerous. In particular, kids of culture are expected to do poorly, expect them to do poorly as a society, and they will do poorly. And I think child allowance is the way to go. I want to say one thing about the coronavirus, and we all know this. It's really hitting kids. They're not going to school. They don't have support of their teachers. Some of these teachers are not good or impatient or have lost patience. Many of them are very good. and cancel these kids. There are counselors in these schools, and there are nurses in these schools to look after their kids. They don't get it. It's a major loss, and they don't get their darn free lunches. Now, some can pick them up if their parents can get there, but those free lunches and free breakfasts, or nearly free lunches and free breakfasts, are critical. They are getting clobbered. And in fact, somebody sent me a study that these kids are not getting their vaccinations. As many as half of them are not getting the vaccinations they are due. So I think to some extent we're underestimating how coronavirus is clobbering poor kids. But the real lesson is we can't tolerate this condition for poor kids in America. A nation as rich as ours cannot tolerate neglecting and even discarding 15 to 25% of its population.
Thanks. Greg, go ahead, Christine, jump in.
So without disagreeing, I think it is an and, not an either or. Because I think that getting the money out is important, but if you're living under conditions of discrimination, or if you're living in terrible neighborhoods, if you don't have access to good health, all of these things are also going to negatively impact children. So I think somehow this country has to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. And yes, child allowances are critical, money is critical, but so is good health, so is addressing racism and things like that in the country. I think we need to figure out how to do both.
Thanks. Greg, can you talk a little bit about what the study says on the impact of poverty on early childhood development?
Sure. I'm looking at the Q&A questions, and there are a lot of really good questions. It's too bad that we can't get to all of them, but a couple of the questions relate to this point. I think in thinking about the question of what the impact of poverty is on kids, and what sort of policy approaches would work well to reduce poverty. Poverty is just one among many inputs into healthy child development. And we're not, I don't think any of us saying that bringing people's income above the poverty line by itself would solve all the problems that poverty has created. So, in thinking about what the impacts of poverty are for early childhood development, it's just one of those, of a number of factors that sometimes need to be addressed with service-oriented programs, sometimes are adequately addressed with income transfer programs. But impacts in early childhood is an area that we probably know least about. We know from studies of the Earned Income Tax Program, for example, about times when benefits have increased, have been associated with achievement increases. The one study that is most telling is a study that is looking at the rollout of food stamps in the 1960s and 1970s, which turned out to be on a county by county basis. So you could have kids who grew up just a few miles apart, born on the same day, one of whom was born into a family in a county where food stamps were already available. The other was born at the same time in a county where food stamps wouldn't be available until they were age 5 or age 6. So the study looked at the timing of when food stamps became available on the kids when they grew up and became adults, and they looked at their cardiovascular health, for example. And what they found was that food stamp availability when the children were conceived or in the birth year were associated with a substantially lower risk of cardiovascular problems in adulthood than were kids who were born into counties where food stamps weren't available until age 5 or age 6. So that's the most definitive evidence so far, I think, about the relative importance of economic resources, in this case provided by a food stamp program in early childhood. I might mention that I'm part of a study that's trying to look at the impact of child allowances on very young kids. It's a neuroscience collaboration. So in a couple of years, we'll know a lot more about this in the context of the current kind of circumstances as opposed to circumstances back in the 60s and 70s. But in general, this evidence is more definitive about detrimental impacts of poverty on somewhat older kids than on kids in very early childhood.
Great, thank you. So for Christine, you know, we've touched upon this a little bit already, but we know that the design and administration of programs has a significant impact on whether families can easily access benefits. So when considering the policies laid out in a roadmap to reducing child poverty or additional assistance, right, that we've seen either enacted or proposed to mitigate the harm caused by COVID, what are some considerations that decision makers on both the federal and state level should have in mind to ensure that these programs are effective to reduce child poverty?
So, of course, it starts with making sure that the program is designed to reach as many children as possible. Sometimes that means you have to pay special attention to those populations you know most difficult to reach. You have to make sure that the funds that you do provide through these programs, to the extent that they can be, are provided in regular intervals. Again, back to that predictability. Building in opportunity to respond to emergencies with the way, you know, that people can hold a reserve or something like that. All of us need that. So why can't we make sure that these poverty programs build that into it? Simplifying the application process, automating it, but then recognizing not all people are going to take advantage of the automated process. Making sure that they're designed in a way that's reflective of those other contextual issues that I talked about in terms of criminal behavior in the past and things along those lines. I also think, though, just someone mentioned the importance of talking with people about how could we make these programs and services more accessible and more designed to address your needs is the one that I'd want to end with, making sure that we listen to the people that are, you know, that are the stakeholders in these programs to make sure that they have a voice.
Great. Thank you. And I just want to say, reminder that you can submit questions at the Q&A tab at the bottom. We see the questions coming in and we're gathering them. So, so thank you for that. Dolores, you know, we know that access to anti-poverty programs for children in immigrant families remains limited. And immigrant families were excluded from much of the assistance included in the recent CARES Act passed by Congress to address COVID. And on top of these exclusions, the public charge rule has caused many immigrant families to avoid accessing benefits that they are eligible for. So what steps should we take to close these eligibility and accessibility gaps for children in immigrant families?
Yeah, thank you, Cara. I think that the first step is probably to raise awareness about the extent of immigrant restrictions and the implications of restricting children of immigrants' access to social programs. I find that academics, the public, and policymakers often don't know the extent of these restrictions. Immigrants are an increasing share of the population and of the workforce, and children of immigrants represent 25% of the child population, up from 6% in 1970. Very importantly, the vast majority, about 90% of children of immigrants are US citizens by birth. So the present public health crisis and economic crisis is having obviously devastating consequences for many Americans, but children in immigrant families are especially affected for many reasons. One is, as we've heard in the news a lot, like the example of the meatpacking workers. Their parents tend to work some of the most dangerous jobs in the low-wage sector in our economy. They're also much more likely to be in jobs that don't have the protections that are needed during a crisis like the one we have. Protections like health insurance or family and medical leave. It's very important, I think, to know that the roots of these problems are deep and go back many decades. They are not happening now because of the pandemic, of course. in contradiction with the increasing importance of children of immigrants in our population over the last few decades in a way that is paradoxical or maybe exclusionary by design, our social policy has become more and more exclusionary of immigrants and children of immigrants. And that has really bad consequences for these families, of course. So what can we do? I think that we should work towards eliminating restrictions for safety net programs for all legal immigrants and for all children of immigrants. We should make tax credits and economic rescue payments such as the CARES Act and an eventual cash allowance available to all families with children, regardless of whether the children have a social security number or a tax identification number. And we can restate eligibility for the tax credits such as the EITC to all individuals who qualify in terms of income, regardless of whether they have a social security number or a tax identification number. It's very important to clarify that this is not science fiction. We had a much more inclusionary social policy regime in terms of inclusion of immigrants up to a few decades ago, and we have become more exclusionary over time. To give an example of a recent change, the 2018 tax law made children that do not have a social security number ineligible for the child tax credit. But up to that point, those children, their families could claim the child tax credit. And the CARES Act, amazingly, given that immigrants have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and the economic crisis in so many ways, is even more restricted. It has excluded US citizen children of undocumented immigrants from direct cash payments. It maintains all the exclusions in safety net programs such as nutrition and health programs. And although the administration has clarified that accessing testing and treatment for COVID will not be considered towards the public charge determination, of course, after there's so many years of a very aggressive anti-immigrant climate in our country, families are understandably very reluctant to access services. I think that it's time that we raise this issue of the immigrant restrictions to a level that becomes part of the regular discussion when we are trying to improve social policy and not a topic that we try to always address kind of at the margin.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pose this next question to Jeff, but Greg, you also might want to jump in as we are talking about how the study measured child poverty. So we've gotten a few questions from the audience around the federal poverty measure and whether it really accurately reflects level of child poverty. And I know that's something that the study also took on. So Jeff, can you talk about, I know you talk about that in your book, and then Greg, if you want to follow up.
Yeah, I feel pretty strongly that we underestimate child poverty. There's a political intention there. If child poverty is lower than it really should be, we don't have to supply as many social goods as we do, and that would be costly. And some political participants don't like that. Just to use a benchmark, in the 1960s, the current official poverty measure was created in the 1960s. It was roughly 50%. I think it was family or household, but it was median income at that point. It fell to 40%, then it fell to 30%. Now I think it's below, it could be as low as 25% of median income. So the actual measure of poverty has fallen significantly compared to median incomes. Now, in the last 20 or 30 years, median incomes have not risen very much, let's keep in mind. It's been the era of stagnant wages, stagnant earnings. They weren't purely stagnant, but they grew very, very slowly. So we have to keep that in mind. That's just a benchmark. The idea of having an official poverty measure based on a criteria that were set in the 1960s and only increased by inflation is nonsense. We have, as you well know, a supplementary poverty measure because everybody, well, I shouldn't say that, but many people were up in arms about the official poverty measure. It's better, but it's only marginally better, frankly, in my view, and it has some flaws, especially for poor people, because the amount you spend on medical care and work expenses and so forth are deducted from your income poor people don't have a lot of money to spend on those kinds of issues. That's just one example. It's very hard to measure poverty. And I think as we go forward, we need, if we want an absolute measure, sure, let's get one. But let's also get a relative measure to supplement it. That is a measure that's based on a percentage of median income.
Our committee was directed to use the supplemental poverty measure. So that was something that we were constrained by, but had we had a choice, we probably would have chosen the supplemental poverty measure. But what it does relative to the official poverty measure is it includes non-cash sources of income, like food stamps, for example, like tax credits, earned income tax credit. And one of the things that we did was to look back over the last 50 years to try to see what would happen to the poverty measure for children if you switch from the official poverty measure to the supplemental poverty measure. And the results are pretty dramatic. The official poverty measure goes up and down with the business cycle, but it has not changed that much in terms of its average level. Child poverty is not that different than what it was back in the late 60s. If you look at the supplemental poverty measure, in contrast, child poverty has been cut almost in half. And if you think about it, a measure that includes food stamps, that includes the earned income tax credit, social programs that were started and expanded in the years since the War on Poverty, you count more resources for families, so you get lower poverty rates. So the other thing we did beyond using the supplemental poverty measure rather than the official poverty measure was to adjust the data. We used the current population survey, the kind of the regular survey that reports on poverty statistics. We adjusted income for underreporting, which we know is a problem in the current population survey. So if you take that survey and see what the total amount of food stamp income is that's reported, it turns out to be not close to 100% of what the actual benefits paid out are. So if you go through an imputation process and try to adjust for underreporting, that in fact lowers the poverty rate. So very crudely, the official poverty measure in the year that we did our analysis was about 19%. If you switch to the supplemental poverty measure, the child poverty rate goes from 19 to about 16%. And then if you adjust for underreporting, it goes from 16% down to 13%. So that 13% child poverty rate was the benchmark that we used to try to come up with ideas for policies and programs that would reduce that by half, in other words, down to 6.5%. So how you count poverty is very important. And the supplemental poverty is better, but there are a lot of other arguments, the kind that Jeff and others have made that indicates that's still not that adequate. And in particular, I saw one of the questions is about medical insurance. And it really, one of the things that we point out in our report is the importance of resources from medical insurance programs like Medicaid, and they're not really counted effectively at all in the supplemental poverty measure or the official poverty measure. And we know from research that when medical insurance programs for children have begun or when they've expanded, you can see quite positive impacts on things like birth weight and early childhood health. So we know that resources from that those programs are helping kids, but that hasn't made it into a report at all because we were using the supplemental poverty measure.
Thanks.
Let me just add, just to reiterate the point, and Greg touches on it slightly. The supplemental poverty measure is not the final answer. Lots of people are calling for a new, as he knows, probably been invited to participate, a new National Academy study on a poverty rate. I think in the end, I very much hope we get an absolute rate significantly adjusted beyond the SPM. Of course, we have to include social programs, but we think about a relative rate, which I think is not perfect either, but is probably a better way of looking at the state of the poor. It's the poor who suffer.
Christine, we've gotten a few questions about what the effect on COVID on child welfare systems and kind of the interaction, right, of child poverty and the child welfare system.
So I think, well, maybe you don't know, most of you on the call, that majority of the children who are in the child welfare system are there because of neglect. And that there is a link between neglect and poverty. Clearly, just because people are low income does not mean that they neglect or abuse their children, but some of the factors around not having resources could result in neglect. So I see the question about, is there a link between the two? And I hope that answers that. I also want to say that the child welfare system itself has seen a explosion in its challenges to serve families without being able to visit with them, talk with them, interact with them. That's been a major impact of the virus, but it's also been a major opportunity of the virus, because particularly with older youth in care, we found that they like to interact using the internet and other kinds of ways of communicating. I think at the end of the day, the combination of the COVID virus and the increased understanding of the significance of racism in this country has made everyone in child welfare recognize the need to think differently about how families in all different systems that interact with the most vulnerable families are structured and operate. So whether it's the school system or the juvenile justice system, the healthcare system, all of us have a lot of work to do to figure out how are we contributing potentially to the racism that's in this country? Or looking at it the other way, how can we help move against it? So I think it's been, for myself and a lot of the people that I know in child welfare and these related systems, a renewal of commitment to looking at what we need to fix, how we can fix it, and the significance of it requiring a cross-sector fix. You know, child welfare alone can't do it. It's got to work with the education system, the public health system. Talking to teachers nowadays, they will tell you that education was not their biggest challenge over the last several months. It was making sure the children that they were attempting to educate had food and were able to get books. And in those communities where there were resources for it, it was easier. In those communities where it was not, they couldn't meet their educational goals. So if each of us look at our goals in a more, in a bigger way, I think we'll understand that we're going to have to do a lot better in this country to form a system, not unlike what they were able to do for older adults, for our children, to make sure that they get the collaborative, cohesive set of services and supports that they need to meet their full potential.
Thank you. Okay, so I think this is our last question. Again, there's contact information in the chat box if you'd like to follow up as well with additional questions. But, you know, two things that we know are really important to COVID, we've seen questions about, and we haven't gotten to talk as much about, are nutrition assistance and paid family leave. And the study, you know, touches upon both of those. So, you know, Dolores, do you want to talk a little bit more about what the study says about the importance of SNAP and nutrition assistance, and as well as paid family leave and kind of in this time?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, very quickly, I think that the report really recognizes the very important role of SNAP, and in a number of different ways. First of all, the introduction of SNAP probably benefited a lot of children, as we know from the evidence in terms of poverty reduction, but also other outcomes, as Greg summarized briefly before. SNAP is also one of the major programs in terms of the effect on poverty reduction. And one of our packages that achieves the goal of reducing poverty by 50% includes an expansion of SNAP as one of the components. So we feel as a committee very strongly that SNAP is a major program for achieving the goal of reducing child poverty by 50%. It also has benefits across racial and ethnic groups. So that we did analyze the role of SNAP. We did not analyze the role of family and medical leave, not because we don't think it's important, but as Christine explained before, we were driven by the evidence, and we don't have strong enough evidence just because there is not enough research yet about the potential poverty reducing effects of family and medical leave. But we know that access to family and medical leave by the FMLA, as well as the ability of families to take leave if they needed it, which of course means, because it's unpaid under federal law, a reduction in their income, is very limited. About 50% of workers have access, and it's, when you consider race and ethnicity, there are really large disparities by race and ethnicity. And Hispanics are the group that has the least protection in terms of both eligibility under FMLA, but also inability to take unpaid leave. And they're also the group more likely to be raising children at this point in the US. So there are a lot of contradictions in our social policy that what we all hope is that the report is going to bring attention to, and given the present crisis, we're going to have an increased sense of urgency about what to do.
Thank you. So I know we're at the top of the hour and there's a lot that we wish we could have gotten to. Again, you can follow up more. So I really want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank our great panelists for this discussion. A reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available both on the Century Foundation's website, the National Academies of Sciences website, and you will be receiving a follow-up email if you registered for this webinar with, some of the resources we discussed. In the meantime, a roadmap to reducing child poverty is available for free download with the link in the chat, and Jeff Madrick's book is available for purchase online. I provided some links to some of First Focus's materials and addressing child poverty and COVID. Century Foundation also has a lot of great resources on the need for a child allowance, expanded unemployment, and a lot benefits, and a lot of other ways to address child poverty and economic inequality. So thank you again, everyone, to joining us, and hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon.
Thank you, Cara.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cara.